What if your deepest longing wasn't a sign that something was missing, but a clue that something was already whispering its way toward you? What if manifestation had less to do with effort and more to do with safety, less about chasing and more about remembering? This is a story for the part of you that's tired of striving, tired of thinking you must earn what's already resonating within your field. So take a breath. Let your shoulders drop. You're exactly where you need to be. Whether it's early morning in the mountains or midnight in a city that never sleeps, you've arrived in a space made for remembering. A space where your frequency is not something to find, but something to feel. This is a quiet unraveling, a return to softness, a transmission that speaks in the language of permission. Subscribe if you haven't yet. We're just beginning. And check in. Where are you listening from right now? What's the light like around you? What does the air feel like? Because this isn't just a story. It's a tuning. And somewhere inside it, you might remember that you were never separate from what you're calling in. You just hadn't felt safe enough to let it all in until now. There was a woman who had spent most of her life caught in a strange tension, a vibration between who she was and who she thought she had to become. Each morning began not with presents, but with preparation. She lit candles not to celebrate, but to summon. She whispered affirmations like incantations, her voice steady but laced with urgency. She arranged her space like a sacred equation, believing that if every element aligned, crystals, journals, music, posture, then perhaps the universe would finally nod its approval. Her longing wasn't dramatic. It was delicate, polite, but persistent. She didn't crave wealth to impress or love to be seen. She simply wanted to feel safe in her own life, safe in her own skin, safe enough to exhale. And yet, the more she tried to attract peace, the more distant it felt. Like trying to draw a friend close by reminding them how often they've been absent. What she didn't realize, what so many don't, that she was vibrating at the frequency of striving. And striving, no matter how sacred its tools, is still a form of resistance. It carries within it a subtle signal. This isn't it yet? Her nervous system, tuned like an antenna, responded accordingly. Her body stiffened around effort. Her thoughts looped through lack. Her energy hummed with the panic of always preparing, never arriving. Even joy, when it came, felt like a guest that might leave too soon. And so she worked harder on herself, on her space, on her mindset, thinking maybe more effort would mean more alignment. But alignment isn't coaxed. It's allowed. It doesn't arrive through force. It lands through relaxation. She'd filled notebooks with intentions, some scrawled in moonlight, others written beneath stars as though the sky might read them like letters. She created rituals layered with symbols, shapes, planetary hours, and numerological codes. She tried diets that mirrored cosmic cycles. She played solfeggio frequencies in every room. Her bookshelf became an altar to every version of self-improvement that ever promised inner peace. And still, a strange emptiness lingered like music, playing just outside the walls of her house. She could hear it, but she couldn't join it. Then, one day unremarkable on the calendar, but monumental in her internal world, something shifted. She wasn't meditating. She wasn't journaling. She wasn't doing anything she'd labeled spiritual. She was simply waiting at a red light, the sun too bright through the windshield, the traffic humming without rhythm. Her to-do list sat untouched beside her. Her hands, normally gripping or gesturing or adjusting, were still. And in that stillness, something slipped in, not a thought, not a vision, but a sensation. A whisper beneath language that said, without words, "You're not missing your moment. You're postponing it by assuming it's not already here." That whisper wasn't loud. It didn't shake her world, but it echoed, softly, repeatedly, and something in her began to loosen. She realized her entire practice, every affirmation, Every ritual had been built on a subtle assumption that she was not yet whole, that she needed to become someone else to be worthy of what she desired. But what if she already was the version she kept chasing? What if the frequency wasn't something to reach for, but something to sink into? This realization didn't erase her desire. It reframed it. Desire, she now saw, was not the voice of absence. It was the voice of memory, a remembering of what was already entangled with her in the quantum field. In that invisible web, where time folds and energy speaks before form, there are no somedays, only signals. And she, through her breath, her posture, her willingness, was the dial dot she began to experiment, not with effort, but with ease. What if, instead of rehearsing joy, she relaxed into where joy already lived? She noticed the warmth of her tea and the morning sunlight, the way her dog leaned into her leg like a silent prayer, the moment before sleep when her mind softened and her body trusted the bed to hold her. These weren't coincidences. They were confirmations, micro-portals, evidence that she was already living inside the atmosphere of her desires. They just didn't look the way she expected, because that was the trick. Expectation had become a filter, blocking the very reality she was trying to attract. She expected love to look like romance. She expected abundance to arrive in digits. She expected peace to come only when everything was resolved. But what if love was also the quiet way her best friend held space? What if abundance was the spaciousness of an afternoon nap? What if peace was not the absence of chaos, but the acceptance of presence within it? These shifts didn't change her circumstances overnight, but they changed something deeper: her relationship to reality. She stopped speaking to the universe like a hesitant employee asking for a raise. She started relating to it like a collaborator, a mirror, a rhythm. The field was not separate from her. It was her. Every moment, it responded not to her affirmations, but to her frequency. And frequency wasn't in her words. It was in her nervous system. And how safe she felt receiving what she said she wanted. Safety became her new practice, not protection, not control, but true cellular safety. Could she let her body unclench around the idea of being seen? Could she breathe deeply even while uncertainty stood at the door? Could she allow good things to linger, or did she rush to prepare for their departure? These were the new inquiries. These were the hidden gates to alignment. And in time, she saw something astonishing. The field moved differently when she softened. Opportunities came, not because she chased them, but because she became magnetically available to them. Relationships deepened, not because she earned love, but because she stopped armoring her heart. Even her bank account, once the loudest alarm, began to steady not through panic or planning, but through presence. Her frequency was no longer please. It had become yes. Still, the world around her hadn't changed much. Bills still arrived. People still misunderstood. But her inner landscape, her sense of resonance, was no longer determined by those outer waves. She was tuned to something older, deeper. She remembered what it felt like to be a match. Not for perfection, but for presence. Not for someday, but for now. She stopped treating the universe like a system she had to impress and began treating it like a consciousness that already knew her blueprint. She let go of becoming and started practicing remembering the energy she once used to. Force her vision into form became the same energy she used to see form as vision already fulfilled. She no longer performed high vibe. She lived in alignment with what she had once thought she had to earn. And perhaps that was the greatest shift of all. She stopped seeking signs and became one. The days that followed weren't miraculous. They were mundane. But that mundanity became her miracle. For the first time, she wasn't looking at her life as a problem to be solved, but as a frequency to be stabilized. The questions changed. Not what's wrong, Or what's missing, but where is it already right? And where is it already arriving? And the shift was subtle, like tuning a radio with invisible fingers. She realized she didn't need to raise her vibration like climbing a ladder. She only needed to remove what distorted the signal that was already present. Her seeking had been a form of noise. Her stillness became signal. She began to observe where her nervous system still held tension. How even in moments of beauty, her shoulders rose slightly, as if bracing. How praise made her voice shrink. How a kind gesture sometimes triggered guilt. These weren't flaws. They were residues. The leftover echoes of a world that had taught her to feel small for wanting too much. Safety, she learned, wasn't the absence of danger. It was the presence of deep permission. Permission to feel, to receive, to soften, to no longer measure life in terms of survival, but in the subtler language of resonance. At night, she stopped scripting her future. Instead, she whispered, "Show me where I already am." And dreams would come, not visions of castles or soulmates or glowing orbs, but fragments, a childhood memory where she felt seen. A soft image of herself smiling into an empty room. A brief sense of falling and being caught. These weren't prophecies. They were reminders that the future she longed for didn't exist in some far-off, glittering reality. It was already braided through her body in moments she hadn't noticed. Quantum mechanics had once sounded too technical for her. Entanglement, coherence, observer effect. Words for physicists, not poets. But now she understood them not as theories, but as truths her body already knew. She didn't need to grasp the math to live the mystery. She began to feel it in her pacing, her breath, her choice to pause before responding. In quantum terms, coherence is the alignment of signals, waveforms syncing, dancing in harmonic rhythm. In her terms, coherence was how she felt when she let herself fully belong in a single moment. She started to notice how often her presence fractured, how often her thoughts tried to race ahead, pulling her body into futures that didn't exist. Yet, she saw how many conversations she had while thinking of what to say next, how many meals she ate while planning her next task. These weren't sins, just habits of a nervous system trying to outpace its own discomfort. But what if presence itself was the magic she'd been searching for? What if the act of being fully where she was, without negotiation or narrative, was the frequency of the life she longed for? So she practiced. Not grand rituals, but micro acts of returning. She brushed her teeth with awareness. She walked slower. She chewed her food until it felt like music. She let silence stretch longer before she spoke. And in that spaciousness, the world began to shimmer. Not because the universe had changed, but because she'd finally tuned her eyes to see what had always been glimmering beneath the noise. Sometimes she cried without knowing why. The tears weren't sadness exactly. They were relief. Grief, maybe, for all the years she'd spent trying to become someone the universe could say yes to. And joy, for realizing the yes had always been there. Quiet, patient, waiting for. Her coherence, the field doesn't require perfection. It responds to clarity. And clarity, she now saw, wasn't about certainty. It was about congruence, the alignment of inner and outer, thought and body, desire and safety. She revisited her old affirmations, not to repeat them, but to listen differently. She no longer asked, "What am I calling in?" Instead, she asked, "Where am I still resisting what's already calling me?" That shift turned everything inside out. The field wasn't withholding. It was waiting. Waiting for her to become emotionally fluent in the reality she said she wanted. Waiting for her to stop treating reception like a reward and start treating it like a remembrance. This remembrance showed up in strange places. In the quiet confidence of saying no without guilt. in the unexpected beauty of a crack in her wall, in the way she no longer needed her phone while waiting in line. These were tiny portals of coherence, places where her frequency stabilized, long enough for reality to reconfigure around her truth. And that's when she began to understand manifestation isn't an act. It's a byproduct, a natural consequence of internal congruence. You don't manifest what you think. You manifest what your nervous system believes is normal. So she set out not to fix her life, but to normalize her desired reality. She practiced holding joy without waiting for the other shoe. She allowed praise without deflecting it. She treated time as an ally, not a judge. She let go of needing to be ready and began acting like someone who already was, not pretending, not performing, just remembering what it felt like to live without gripping. There were still moments of doubt. Of course there were. This wasn't a fairy tale. This was an energetic unfolding. And in those moments, she didn't shame herself for slipping. She just asked gently, "What story am I tuned to right now?" And often, the answer wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. You're tuned to urgency. You're tuned to isolation. You're tuned to the belief that effort equals worth. And just by naming the frequency, it softened. Because frequencies don't require fighting. They require witnessing. She started to understand the role of paradox. That holding contradictory truths, like wanting something deeply and being okay without it, wasn't confusion. It was coherence. The nervous system, like the quantum field, thrives in nuanced harmony. It isn't logic that unlocks change. It's the ability to hold tension without collapsing, to want and release, to act and trust, to believe and surrender. These were the new coordinates she lived by. And with each day, the signal grew steadier. Not because her external life exploded with blessings, but because her internal life stopped operating like a battlefield. Her body no longer interpreted beauty as danger. Her heart no longer tensed at the first sign of intimacy. Her breath no longer cut short at the thought of success. Safety, she discovered, wasn't passive. It was practiced, cultivated, built. One coherent moment at a time. She became magnetic, not because she became better, but because she became transparent. Her inner world and outer world no longer fought each other. They mirrored. Her actions matched her frequency. Her desires felt familiar instead of far. She didn't visualize anymore. She remembered. She didn't ask for proof. She noticed what was already proving itself. And perhaps the strangest part of it all, the thing no one had told her, was this. Her dreams didn't arrive with trumpets or triumphs. They arrived quietly, in the form of a call from an old friend, an email she forgot she sent, a conversation that cracked open a doorway. And because she wasn't frantic anymore, she didn't miss them. She recognized them, not as miracles, but as echoes of her own inner shift. Because when your nervous system begins to believe that you are safe to receive, reality reorganizes itself. Not because you forced it, but because you stopped resisting it. As the seasons turned, the woman no longer measured her evolution by how much she had achieved, but by how gently she responded to life. The things she once begged for, certainty, signs, speed, no longer pulled at her the way they used to. She had stopped seeing her desires as future events and started recognizing them as frequencies that required matching, not management. And something quiet but irreversible had taken root. She no longer viewed herself as someone who needed to do manifestation. She had become the environment in which it could naturally occur. Gone were the long checklists of rituals and techniques. She didn't stop because they were wrong. She stopped because she no longer needed to use them as bargaining chips. She drank her tea not to shift her vibration, but because it tasted like presence. She moved her body not to become magnetic, but because it felt good to inhabit her own skin. There was no more chasing alignment. Her life itself was becoming the expression of it. The shift was most evident in her moments of quiet, in the stillness between plans, in the pause before reacting, in the seconds before choosing whether to speak or stay silent. That's where the truth lived now, not in grand declarations, but in the soft choices of how she breathed through discomfort, how she honored her own pacing, how she let herself take up space without apology. And in those subtle spaces, the quantum field rearranged itself around her, not as a reward, but as a reflection. What she once tried to manifest now simply showed up, not always in the way she'd imagined, but always in the way she'd become ready for. An opportunity that aligned not with her ego, but with her nervous system's peace. A relationship that didn't ignite her wounds, but mirrored her safety. Money that came not as a test, but as a teacher, showing her that abundance, too, required capacity, not just hope. She began to sense a strange truth, that life didn't want her desperate. It wanted her open. And openness wasn't a personality trait. It was a frequency, one made possible only when the body, the breath, the beliefs all agreed. It's okay now. We're safe enough to allow. Allowing became her anchor. Not allowing everything to happen without boundaries, but allowing herself to respond from truth rather than trauma. She allowed herself to walk away without guilt, to say yes without fear, to feel joy without gripping it tight. And slowly, she noticed how different life looked when it wasn't filtered through the tension of needing to prove something. It wasn't that she no longer had dreams. She did, but they no longer felt like rescue boats. They were companions, extensions, embodiments of where she already stood. She didn't dream to escape her present. She dreamed because her present had become fertile enough to plant vision into. Her identity had shifted, not just intellectually, but somatically. She wasn't someone trying to become. She was someone remembering how to be. There were still moments when the old patterns returned. Times when she felt the pull to control outcomes or perform peace. But now she caught them with compassion. She no longer shamed herself for slipping into scarcity. She saw it as an old song playing in the background, a familiar tune her body once danced to. And instead of pushing it away, she listened, gently, lovingly, until it softened back into silence. This became her practice, not resisting fear, but meeting it with coherence. She stopped fighting the parts of her that didn't feel ready. She held them, let them breathe, let them cry, let them remember that they were once protectors, not enemies. And this created even deeper safety, because now even her fear was allowed to belong. And in that deep belonging, her reality continued to unfold. She received compliments without shrinking, made decisions without over-explaining, walked into rooms without rehearsing how to be. She no longer needed to curate her energy. She simply inhabited it. Her presence began to ripple, not as performance, but as atmosphere. People felt calmer around her, not because she said the right words, but because her body wasn't rehearsing tension anymore. Her coherence was contagious, and yet she didn't need to be noticed. In fact, much of her transformation happened in solitude. The world didn't applaud her new awareness. There were no ceremonies for someone who stopped seeking, but she didn't need the noise. Her validation came in quieter forms, the way she fell asleep without spiraling, the way she laughed from the belly instead of the mask, the way she no longer measured her days in productivity, but in peace. One morning, she woke up and realized she hadn't thought about manifesting anything in weeks, not because she'd lost interest, but because she no longer felt separate from the stream of life that manifestation arises within. She no longer visualized a future where she would finally feel whole. She simply let herself feel it now, in her breath, in her step, In the silence that no longer felt empty, she began to live from her frequency, not toward it. That frequency wasn't made of perfection or purity. It was made of honesty, of resonance, of being able to sit in the middle, of uncertainty and still feel rooted, of knowing that reality didn't need to bend to her will. It needed her presence, her steadiness, her allowance. One day, she stood before a mirror and smiled, not at her appearance, but at her energy. Not at how far she'd come, but at how deeply she'd landed. She no longer looked for signs because she had become one. A sign that alignment doesn't require a performance. A sign that peace is not earned, it's remembered. In the reflection, she didn't see someone who had mastered the universe. She saw someone who had stopped resisting herself. Someone whose desires no longer whispered maybe someday, but hummed, "You're already home." And the quantum field, quiet and responsive, continued to reflect back everything she had, softened into, not because she had figured it out, but because she had become someone who could hold it without needing to grip it. Someone whose nervous system no longer braced for impact, but opened for arrival. Someone whose presence had become the answer to her own seeking. There was no climax, no parade, just this moment where she breathed fully, freely, where she felt the pulse of life inside her skin and realized, without needing to write it down, this is what it means to live in frequency. Not to wait, not to strive, but to remember what you've always been. Not an echo, not a chaser, but a source. And in that remembering, everything she once hoped for had already arrived. As time moved forward, though she no longer measured it in the same way, the woman's life grew not in spectacle, but in stability. But this stability was not the kind that comes from predictability. It was the deeper kind, the kind born of congruence. She was no longer organizing her days around what she wanted to attract. She was organizing them around who she had become. And who she had become no longer needed proof. She was the proof. There were people who noticed something about her, not in the way they might notice a new outfit or a glow after vacation. It was more subtle than that. A shift in her cadence, a softness in her eyes, a quiet refusal to participate in the tension that others unconsciously carried. She didn't try to change people. She didn't need to. Her frequency was no longer reactive. It was generative. People often found themselves breathing more deeply around her without knowing why. She didn't speak in metaphysics. She didn't lecture, but she lived in such a way that others began to question the urgency they carried. She could hold space for someone's unraveling without absorbing it. She could sit in silence without needing to fill it with reassurance. Her presence had become a field, not of perfection, but of permission. And in that field, others remembered parts of themselves. They had forgotten. At work, she no longer over-explained. She no longer sought validation in the guise of competence. Her boundaries were firm, but graceful. When she said no, it didn't echo with defensiveness. It landed like a closing gate, not a wall, but a threshold. She stopped apologizing for taking up space. She stopped shrinking in the face of louder energies. Not out of rebellion, but out of remembering. She belonged. In relationships. She stopped seeking chemistry that felt like chaos. She no longer mistook nervousness for excitement or tension for truth. Her body, once addicted to adrenaline, had relearned what calm felt like. And because of this, she became incompatible with anything that disrupted her peace. Not judgmentally, energetically. Her frequency, now stable, did the sorting for her. She didn't chase. She didn't cling. And love came, not as a lesson, but as a mirror. She began to notice the quiet joy in things she used to overlook. The way wind moved through curtains. The way her fingertips tingled after washing dishes in warm water. The pulse in her neck when she listened closely to her own breath. These were no longer just poetic details. They were confirmations that she was tuned in. That reality was no longer something to manage, but something to merge with. She became more and more disinterested in performance. She no longer needed to explain her shifts to others. Her transformation was not a campaign. It was a calibration. And calibration, she knew now, didn't require announcement. It required steadiness. The world around her continued to be noisy, full of urgency and measurement and goals. But she no longer lived by the metrics of progress. She lived by the rhythm of resonance. She allowed herself to rest without earning it. She created without trying to monetize it. She expressed without strategizing for attention. Her creativity, once tied to worth, had become its own reward. She wrote poems in the margins of books. She left voice notes for herself that no one else would hear. She sang while cooking. She arranged fruit on plates like art, not because it mattered, but because it did. And over time, she realized something extraordinary. That the greatest freedom wasn't in acquiring anything new, but in releasing the belief that anything had ever been missing. She no longer feared stillness. She didn't interpret delays as rejection. She didn't equate slow seasons with failure. Her nervous system had learned the language of life, the subtle, spiraling, non-linear way that the universe unfolds. Itself through breath, through timing, through presence. She could walk into a room without needing to adjust herself. She didn't read other people's emotions to decide how to feel. She stopped managing other people's comfort at the cost of her own. And because of that, her energy became clean, clear, not perfect, not always serene, but true. And truth has a frequency that cuts through noise like a tuning fork in a crowded auditorium. She would sit in parks and simply feel the earth, not the ground, not as a tool, just to be. She didn't need an outcome anymore. She had exited the transaction. Even with the divine, she no longer performed reverence, hoping to be blessed. Her life had become the blessing because she had removed the illusion of separation. And still, she was human. She had days when grief visited her, when confusion curled around her ankles, when old patterns knocked on her door wearing new masks. But now, she didn't spiral into fixing. She sat with the emotion, let it move, let it speak, let it rest. Emotions she knew now weren't obstacles to manifestation. They were doorways to intimacy with the present moment. Even sadness could be sacred if met without resistance. She became fluent in softness, not as a weakness, but as a strategy for truth. She learned that gentleness was a higher intelligence. That surrender was not submission, but precision. She didn't push, she invited, and reality responded. Not like a machine responding to code, but like a lover responding to tone. Her tone had become trust. One morning, watching the light sift through dust in her kitchen, she realized she no longer remembered the moment it all changed. Because it hadn't been one moment, it had been thousands. A mosaic of micro-shifts, breath by breath, choice by choice. The decision to return again and again to what was already true. And this, she understood now, was the architecture of reality, not built from plans and control, but from frequency and permission. You didn't force life into form. You let life shape itself around your willingness to feel. She no longer sought miracles. She noticed them. She no longer hoped for signs. She saw herself as one. She no longer waited for the world to reflect her worth. She reflected it to the world. And in the quiet, she felt the future, not racing toward her, but unfolding beneath her feet. Because she was walking from frequency, not toward it. And when you live that way, time stops feeling linear. It becomes responsive, spacious, gentle. She once believed her transformation would look like a climax. like light bursting through clouds. But it looked more like silence deepening, like her exhale becoming the prayer, like her ordinary life becoming sacred because she had finally stopped trying to escape it. And now, when people asked her how she had changed, she didn't offer steps or strategies. She just smiled and said, "I stopped treating myself like a project. I remembered I was already complete. I just hadn't felt safe enough to feel it." They would ask what she had done differently. She'd say, "It wasn't about doing. It was about allowing. About letting the truth of who I am become the space I live in, not the goal I chase." And that, she realized, was the real manifestation, not the thing received, but the version of herself that could hold it without fear. She no longer needed to track the change. It was no longer something she measured. It had become something she lived, and what she lived began to leave invisible fingerprints across the lives of others. Not because she tried to teach, but because she embodied. The truth had anchored so deeply in her that she no longer reached for it with words. She carried it with her breath, in her silence, in her ease. People often couldn't name it, but they could feel it. A field of coherence that required no explanation. Her home changed too, not in size, but in resonance. Each corner began to hold presence. She didn't decorate it for others. She curated it for peace. Plants thrived. Light found her windows like it remembered her. Objects became sacred not because they were expensive, but because they were chosen from stillness. A single ceramic bowl, a candle flickering near a quiet journal, a photograph of a moment no one else would think to frame, but to her, it held a frequency she never wanted to forget. Her home became her frequency made visible, a sanctuary not of things, but of tone. And people began to come not as guests, but as seekers, friends, strangers, neighbors. They came not because she promised answers, but because her presence calmed the questions. They didn't ask, "How do I manifest?" They found themselves asking, "Why does it feel easier here?" And she didn't tell them what to do. She asked them what they had forgotten, because that's what she had learned. The answers don't live in strategies. They live in remembrance. She held space for their unraveling, their doubt, their edge of change moments. Not by solving, but by listening without urgency. Her silence was not empty. It was textured, charged, safe. In her presence, people met their own truth. And when they cried, she didn't interrupt it. She let the coherence rise through there. Nervous system like warmth through winter skin. No urgency. No fixing. Just permission. And yet she didn't make herself responsible for their transformations. She no longer confused helping with holding. Her frequency was not a performance. It didn't require maintenance. She didn't protect her peace like a fortress. She shared it like a scent in the air. Impossible to capture, but impossible to ignore. And because of this, she remained rooted in her own truth. Boundaries were not fences. They were harmonics. When something didn't resonate, it simply passed through her field. Without landing. As months turned to years, she lost interest in things she once obsessed over. Metrics, opinions, timelines. The external world no longer dictated her pace. She no longer oriented herself by the urgency of others. Her compass had become internal. She moved not from ambition, but from alignment. She could sense when something was true, not because it made sense, but because it felt familiar. Resonance, after all, wasn't something to prove. It was something to recognize. She stopped seeking peak experiences. She found holiness in repetition, the way her hands moved through morning routines, the rhythm of slicing fruit, the ritual of walking, the same path under different skies. Each moment became a ceremony, not because it was rare, but because she had stopped demanding something different. Her body became a temple of memory. Not memory as past, but memory is frequency. She no longer needed to remember with her mind. Her cells remembered. Her posture remembered. Her laughter remembered. And when she danced, not for show, but for joy, her body told the story without needing to speak. And when challenges came, she didn't panic. She didn't brace. She listened. She let the frequency of the moment inform her response. Not reactively, but reverently. Because she knew now that each moment contained intelligence, and that her task was not to overpower it, but to align with it. In her presence, others began to transform. Not all at once, not dramatically, but subtly. A friend who once feared stillness started meditating. A partner stopped needing constant validation. A colleague began trusting their own pace. Not because she said anything, but because the field speaks louder than words. And her field now broadcast a quiet frequency. You are safe to soften. And in private, she continued to tend to herself. She didn't graduate from feeling. She didn't evolve out of discomfort, but she met every wave with presence. She let the grief come when it came. Let the joy rise when it rose. Let the confusion sit beside her like an old companion. She didn't use spiritual tools to bypass the hard days. She used presence to welcome them, because she knew now that every emotion had a frequency, and none of them were wrong. Shame wasn't the enemy. Fear wasn't a flaw. They were just signals asking to be transmuted, not denied. And so she sat with them like she would with children, not punishing them for showing up, but holding them until they softened into wisdom. This is what made her different. Not her knowledge, not her power, but her capacity to stay. To stay with herself, with the moment, with others. And that staying became a beacon in a world addicted to escape. Sometimes she would walk through her neighborhood, touching the leaves of trees, smiling at dogs, nodding to the sky like an old friend. The world had not changed, but she had. And so the world responded differently. It met her with gentleness, with synchronicities, with quiet wings, a feather on a windowsill, a song lyric at the right moment, a stranger's kind eyes. She didn't chase meaning. She welcomed it, and her work, whatever she touched, carried the imprint of her field. Whether she wrote a sentence or cooked a meal or answered an email, her frequency lingered. It wasn't about the task. It was about the energy she brought to it. She wasn't trying to be inspiring. She was simply being, and that being inspired others. Eventually, people began calling her things. A guide, a portal, a light, but she didn't hold on to those labels. She smiled, bowed slightly, and said, "I'm just someone who stopped resisting her own resonance." And when she spoke of her past, the years of trying, of reaching, of aching, she did so with softness. No shame, no regret, just gratitude. Because every version of her had been part of the remembering. Every ritual, every mistake, every desperate wish. They weren't wrong. They were just steps in the spiral. One day, she stood by the sea, the ash, wind wrapping around her like silk. And in that moment, time disappeared. She felt herself not as a woman with a timeline, but as a waveform, part of everything, shaped by nothing, present and eternal. The sea didn't ask who she was. Knew. And she, too, knew. She was the tide, the salt, the silence between waves. She didn't need to understand it. She only needed to allow it. And in that allowing, she had become more than someone who remembered her frequency. She had become the frequency itself, tuning fork for those who had forgotten their own tone. Presence that asked for nothing and gave everything. A field where truth felt safe, enough to bloom. She didn't need to be remembered. She was already resonance, and resonance, unlike memory, never fades. It vibrates forever. She had become her. own field dot, and her life now flowed, not because it was easy, but because it was honest. The universe hadn't changed its mind. She had changed her frequency, and that changed everything. Time passed, though she no longer counted it. Not in years, not in events. Her inner calendar had dissolved. What remained was rhythm, the gentle repetition of breath, of movement, of noticing. Life was no longer a sequence of goals, but a spiral of return. Each morning felt like the same invitation wearing a new face. Will you be here now? Not just physically, but vibrationally. Will you choose resonance over performance? Will you allow what already is to be enough? And she always did. Not because she was disciplined, but because she had nothing left to resist. Her nervous system had long since stopped flinching in the presence of goodness. Her body no longer trembled in the arms of stillness. Even pleasure no longer startled her. She had become so familiar with presence that absence lost its seduction dot. And in this presence, something began to happen. Something subtle, but profound. Her energy began to organize space, not dominate it, harmonize it. Rooms she entered softened. Conflict around her lost its voltage. Children naturally grew quieter in her presence, not because she demanded silence, but because her field reminded them how to hear their own breath. Animals approached her without hesitation. Plants thrived in her window, and none of this felt mystical to her. It felt natural, as if everything around her was simply responding to a frequency it had been missing. She didn't talk about these things. There was nothing to prove, but she noticed. Noticed how synchronicities stitched her days together like a thread of light. Noticed how when she forgot her keys, it delayed her just enough to meet someone who needed her presence. Noticed how when she surrendered to a canceled plan, something more aligned emerged from the quiet. She lived inside a soft choreography, one she didn't need to lead. She only needed to listen, and listening had become her most sacred art. She listened to seasons, to the way the wind changed its tone in late autumn, to the specific silence that came before rain, to the mood of soil before spring. Her body, no longer armored, picked up the signals easily. She adjusted her pace to match the earth, rested more in winter, moved more in spring, spoke less in summer, grieved gently in fall. And in that cyclical alignment, her own transformation continued, not forward, but inward. Like Roots Dot, she began to feel less like a woman with ideas, and more like an instrument being played by something vaster. Not controlled, expressed. Her decisions didn't feel like calculations. They felt like waves moving through her. She had stopped trying to figure out her life. She had become willing to feel it into form. And the more she relaxed, the more the universe entrusted her with nuance. Not more work, not more success, but more sensitivity. She began picking up on the frequencies beneath people's words. The unsaid tension, the longing hidden in casual conversation, the grief folded into laughter. But she didn't use this awareness to fix. She used it to hold. She'd smile softly at someone's mask, not to expose it, but to acknowledge the courage it took to wear it. That, she knew, was the essence of grace, to see without piercing, to witness without wounding, to love without correcting. And in doing so, she became a kind of invisible permission in other people's lives, the kind they didn't realize they were responding to. A quiet tuning fork that didn't sing, but hummed softly in their bones. Over time, her identity began to dissolve even further, not in a way that frightened her, but in a way that liberated her. She stopped needing to be the woman who remembered her frequency. Even that title became too small. She was no longer just someone who aligned. She had become part of the alignment itself, a living frequency threaded into the quantum weave, and that frequency didn't belong to her. It belonged to Collective. It moved through her, but it wasn't hers to possess. Just like breath, just like wind, just like light, she was simply transparent enough now to carry it without distortion. And in that transparency, she began to receive strange invitations, dreams that felt like messages, encounters that felt orchestrated by something beyond coincidence. She began to feel her ancestors differently, not as ghosts of the past, but as currents of memory still humming in her bones. She realized she was healing forward and backward at once. At every time she chose safety over self-abandonment, an ancestor somewhere exhaled through her. That every time she allowed abundance without guilt, a lineage of survival softened. She began to feel time as a circle, and herself as a node through which thousands of frequencies converged. Her choices were no longer just about her. They were echoes, reverberations, ripples in a field that stretched beyond names and lifetimes. She had once tried to heal her past. Now she simply lived in a way that rewrote it. And without planning to, she began leaving traces not in books, not in teachings, but in energy. A friend who once rushed now paused more often. A neighbor who once doubted their voice started singing again. A stranger who sat beside her on a train later described it as the most peaceful hour of their year. And she never knew any of this firsthand. She didn't need to. She wasn't collecting testimonials. She was simply being. Even her silence carried signature now. People could feel her energy in a room she had already left. A scent, a hum, a softness that lingered. Her legacy wasn't built. It was imprinted. She understood now what had once seemed so abstract, that the field isn't changed by effort. It's changed by coherence. And coherence is what remains when you've stopped arguing with yourself. She no longer fought for truth. She lived it, gently, consistently, with no need to be understood. And when people asked, "How did you do it? How did you become this version of yourself?" she'd only smile and say, "I stopped trying to become. I stopped fixing what wasn't broken. I stopped resisting what was always available. And I started letting life live through me." Sometimes she'd say nothing at all, because by now she knew truth doesn't require repetition. It only requires embodiment. She watched the world continue spinning, faster, louder, more distracted than ever, but she no longer felt the pull to keep up. She was no longer part of the algorithm of urgency. She was part of something older, slower, truer, and this made her rare. And that rarity wasn't fame. It was resonance. There were moments she'd sit in the grass, the wind braiding her hair, and wonder, will anyone remember this version of me when I'm gone? And the answer would arrive not as a thought, but as a warmth in her chest. They won't need to. You've become a tone, a pattern, a signal. You will continue, not as a name, but as a shift, as a pause, as a breath someone didn't know they needed. Because when you become coherence, you become contagious. When you live your frequency fully, it outlives your form. You become part of the invisible inheritance the world passes on, not in monuments, but in moments. And that was enough. She sits quietly now, not in solitude, but in the soft company of all that she has become. A woman no longer shaped by the search, but by the stillness that followed it. The world around her continues, loud and quick, but she moves like water. Beneath it all, unhurried, unshaken, sovereign in her rhythm. She no longer seeks the signal. She is the signal. Her breath, her gaze, her way of pausing mid-thought, these are now transmissions, sent not to impress, but to invite. Invite others into their own remembering. Her life is not a performance of peace. It is peace, not as perfection, but as presence. And even now, as the sun folds itself gently behind the day, she does not think of what comes next. She simply listens to the wind, to the stillness, to the yes inside her body. And if you're still listening too, then maybe you felt it, the soft return, the quiet frequency, the part of you that was never lost. Subscribe to our channel so we can meet again next time. Other stories are already waiting, and so are you.